Hi, welcome to the UPS store.
Yeah, I'd like to ship this package.
Great, I can help you with that and every other ing.
Did you just say every other ing?
Printing, packing, copying, faxing, freighting, any ing your small business needs.
Shredding.
Yep.
Mailboxing.
Uh-huh.
Notarizing?
That too.
Wow, that's really some ing.
Now you're getting it.
The UPS Store. Every ing for small business. And of course, shipping. The UPS Store franchise locations are independently owned and operated. Services, pricing, and hours may vary. See Center for details.
This is a CBC podcast.
Well, if all goes according to the provincial government's plan, this fall, Nova Scotians will have to abide by a new law that protects biodiversity in the province. Not everyone thinks the Biodiversity Act is a good idea. This past weekend, a full-page ad paid for by Forest Nova Scotia appeared in the Chronicle Herald. The group that represents 600 members, including small woodlot owners as well as industrial players, such as sawmills, logging and trucking contractors, and pulp and paper mills. Now, the ad warns that private landowners and the new legislation will give the government broad and unprecedented authority over their property. Jeff Bishop is the executive director of Forest Nova Scotia, and he joins us now. Hi there, Jeff.
Hey, Preston. Thanks for having me on.
Some of our reporting yesterday said that private landowners would be able to immediately opt out of this Biodiversity Act. Do you buy that?
There's a number of different parts of the Act, Preston, when you look at it. And some of those pieces, as we've heard from our partners in government, and we've spoken to them about this over the last couple of years, they've talked about the voluntary aspect of it being within these biodiversity management zones. It's the other pieces of the legislation that empowers government, quite broadly, that we're more concerned about.
Okay. Let's talk about the ad you put in the paper. The only name that appears on the ad is the Concerned Private Landowner Coalition. Now, you're with a group called Forest Nova Scotia, and that doesn't appear in the ad, even though your organization paid for the ad. Why didn't you use your name, the Forest Nova Scotia, in the ad?
Right. We have been discussing with folks within our own sector and more broadly for the last 2 years about previous versions of this bill, Bill 4, its current version of it, and our concerns about it, and trying to reach out to more and more folks just to make sure that they're aware of what it is. And so as we were having those and wanted to speak up more publicly, one of the issues that we have continuously been finding is people keep making an assumption that this is a forestry-only issue because it's under the Department of Lands and Forestry. And it's a big issue because this is going to affect farmers. It's going to affect people who own land for recreation purposes, for conservation purposes, whatever you own private land for. This act is going to have an impact on it. So we've been reaching out to groups and companies that aren't part of our organization. So we felt it was more accurate of the folks that we've been speaking to.
Okay, but does this group even exist, the Concerned Private Landowner Coalition?
It's not a formal organization. No, you're right, Preston. We didn't feel that we had to go that far, if you will.
Okay. You're the executive director of Forest Nova Scotia. Jeff, what's in it for you to get these non-forestry groups on board and aware of the new legislation?
Well, as I say, since 2019, when a first iteration of this bill came around, Preston, we have called for, in discussions with governments since that time, clear legislation that provides for actual protection of biodiversity while respecting landowners' rights. Those are the two big key pieces that we feel are missing from previous versions of this act and this version of it. And so we want to make sure, as I say, this is not just a forestry issue. And so because of that, we want to make sure all Nova Scotians who are landowners have an understanding of what the impact really will be.
Okay, well, let's say you're a small woodlot owner. How will this act, the Biodiversity Act, affect the way that you're able to harvest trees in the way that you like to do it?
Right. If you take, I'll dive into a little bit of the nitty gritty of it, of the bill itself, Preston. You take Section 38(1) or 2, and combine that with Section 53(1)H it really those two pieces of the legislation empower Cabinet itself to make regulations that can control any activities on Crown land or on private land that they would like to do. So, in your example, Preston, they could say, and let's use the ridiculous, maple trees. You can no longer take any maple trees in Nova Scotia on private lands. They could say you can no longer harvest, mushrooms. They could tell farmers in these certain areas of the province, you can no longer grow the crops that you've been growing for 100 years on your family farm.
Is there a legitimate concern that somebody might tell you can no longer harvest mushrooms or maple trees? Is that realistic?
Absolutely. That's the problem when we look at legislation and we don't get to see the regulations that come behind it, something we've been talking about for 2 years but have yet to see those regulations. You have to test it in a way, right? Because if this piece of legislation becomes law, there is a chance it will actually be tested in a legal setting, right? Mm-hmm. If someone violates the regulations or the legislation in one way or the other. So there is going to be a test of that at some point. And that's what we're asking for people to understand now, is that something you may think may seem unreasonable, some of the examples that I just gave, Preston, could entirely be at the whim of Cabinet, could be possible. And that's what you have to think about in the way that is how legislation will be tested at some point in the future.
Under this act, you'll be compensated if, under the whim of Cabinet, they decide that you can't harvest for whatever reason. If there's an economic loss incurred, you'll be compensated. Is my interpretation correct there?
Actually, it's off a little bit there, Preston, because the only time that they refer to compensation that may be available to a landowner would be under what they're calling the biodiversity management zones, when a landowner agrees to be a part of the process. Then they would be eligible. Under the emergency orders, no, there would be no compensation. And under any other decision that they make under those two sections of the Act that I referred to earlier, there is no compensation mentioned whatsoever.
What are some of the other?
Only if the voluntary process.
Sorry, Jeff. What are some of the other reasons you oppose the Biodiversity Act?
One of the others that we've spoken for 2 years while we've been working on this file has been the broad, unwieldy power that this legislation gives to the minister. We fully understand that legislation is written in a way that empowers a minister or their department on their behalf to take action. That's the reason you have legislation. But this is written so broad that it uses a phrase in Section 7. The minister may take any measure the minister considers necessary for the conservation of biodiversity in this province. That is far too broad. There are no defining pieces that back that up or give us comfort of what those powers will be. And the constant reference by folks that say, well, that'll be in the regulations. Well, we've been talking about this for 2 years, and we've yet to see the regulations.
Tell me about
the words "trust me" don't hold much water on this one.
Tell me about the consultation that the province has made with Forest Nova Scotia about this act.
Right. As I say, we've been part of discussions over the last 2 years, Preston, and sharing our concerns about the pieces that are in the Act. Having consultation doesn't mean we agree. And I'm a little concerned over the last 24 hours or so of some discussions around that. The folks are implying that, well, you were consulted. Absolutely, we were. But we wrote a letter, and my name signed on the bottom of it, from Forest Nova Scotia last week to reiterate to the Premier and to the Minister our concerns that we've had for the last 2 years. Consultation does not mean you agree when you walk away from the table.
Yeah.
And so, yes, we were absolutely part of discussions and consultations on this. But if you talk to folks that were also part of those, many of them, that's what they were doing, was sharing their concerns and suggestions of changes, those sorts of things. That's what the consultation process is.
Right.
So consultation doesn't mean we agree.
I understand, yeah.
Right.
Jeff, if private landowners are good stewards of their land, protecting biodiversity on their own, why would that landowner have any issues at all with the Act?
Well, it also begs the question, your premise, Preston, of if they are doing that, absolutely. Why do we need an act like this?
Should private landowners who have sole authority over the land they own, or does the government have the right to enact some regulations on private land when it's acting for the greater good for today or future generations?
Folks in our sector are more than familiar with the regulatory regime that guides what they do in terms of forest management. There are existing pieces of legislation that guide forestry activities across this province, from the Endangered Species Act to the Environment Act to the Wilderness Areas Protection Act and the effect it can have on, to the Wildlife Act,
right,
to the Forestry Act. There's lots of legislation that already exists. And it's really interesting. A number of those that I just named off are actually named in this bill as not being sufficient enough. They're just not doing the work. And that's concerning to me, that we're talking about 4 or 5 pieces of existing legislation that just aren't cutting it. Mm-hmm. And now we have to add another one to try and patch the holes.
Okay.
That's very concerning to me. We're talking about being first and not being better.
Gotcha. Jeff, sorry, we're running out of time. I appreciate you coming on and talking to us.
Thank you, Preston. As always, a pleasure to talk with you.
Jeff Bishop is Executive Director of Forests Nova Scotia. We tweeted a link to the Biodiversity Act on our Twitter page at InfoMorning. If you want to share your thoughts on this, call our talkback line at 1-800-582-5526.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.